So we've been studying Romans chapter 9, where Paul starts dealing with Israel. And again, this is specifically applicable to the Jewish brethren in Rome as he's beginning to apply certain characteristics regarding Israel as a nation and how they see themselves and, of course, how they see the Gentiles. And so when he describes the promises, verse 4 and 5, and that Israel has had the means to be able to obey, but they have not chosen to do so. Verse 6, but it is not that the word of God has taken no effect, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel. He goes back in the timeline and the genealogy to going back to Jacob, go all the way, really starting with the promises of Abraham, and then from Abraham on through Isaac and Jacob, and then describing the fact that through a process that was contrary to the natural inclination in which was established already. Okay, Jacob was chosen as opposed to Esau. And specifically, as he gets into verse 8, those who are the children of the flesh, they are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as a seed. Keep in mind that the Jews' entire identity was meshed into their line, their genealogy of going back to Abraham. That's what they took so much pride in. That's how they kind of identified themselves in relation to being the people of God. They counted themselves according to the promise to Abraham as being the seed. But they're not. And that's part of the reason why Paul goes into describing the fact that no, those who are of the flesh are not necessarily of Abraham's seed, because the implication here, and of course what's described, he doesn't mention Ishmael, but that's what's implied as Paul goes through this. Children of Abraham would include Ishmael's seed, but they are not according to the promise. And so he establishes that baseline, and then it opens it up as well to verse 10 and 11 to describe from Jacob and Esau, and the fact that as Rebekah has these, as Rebekah has these children, verse 11, Jacob and Esau, well, theoretically Esau is the line of Jacob, and as a result, is the line of Isaac, and as a result, should be a part of the promise, but it's not. Okay, it's not that God is arbitrary, and it's not that he is judging based on good or evil. That's why verse 11 is so important. For the children yet not being born, nor having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls. It was said to her, the older shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. All of this is in addressing whether or not the Jews by birth and by nature were a part of this plan of God, which of course through the lineage of bringing about the Christ they were. But since the Christ has come and the old law has been done away with, the Jews no longer have some innate or inborn connection to God or to salvation or to anything else as a result of that birth. That is no longer a part of it. God simply chose his will to come. Paul's writing all of this specifically to speak to this Jewish mentality of them being special according to their bloodline. In other words, Paul says, listen, Jews, you hang your hat on the fact that you are of the bloodline of Abraham, but the fact is, God specifically used the bloodline of Abraham to bring about the Christ. There is nothing innate or by your birth that sets you apart from anyone else. And that's why he's gone through verse 13. It's not that the Jews as a whole were good people and the rest weren't, and therefore God chose the Jews. That's not the situation. The situation was God made a promise to Abraham, and through his line the Christ would come. God didn't show favoritism to the extent that he was arbitrary in that decision. This was a plan that he had established before the world began. Just like with Esau. Esau, it wasn't that God didn't like Esau. He simply chose Jacob. But again, this has nothing to do with salvation. And that's the key component here, because Romans 9 is a mainstay of the idea of predestination. And the idea that those who have been elected to salvation have been elected since the foundation of the world, and that You can't be saved or lost. God's already chosen it. This is the main text for that. However, Paul is not describing salvation. Just because God chose to bring about his will ultimately in Christ through Jacob doesn't mean Esau couldn't serve the Lord. And the same is true for anything outside of the exact lineage that God chose to bring about the Christ. The same was true for anybody. So when he gets down to verse 14, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. And it's in the context of this mercy and compassion is again not in context to salvation. It's in context to God choosing whom he's going to use to bring about his will. And we noted, as Paul says in verse 17, he brings out the concept of Pharaoh. For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. Therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills he hardens. We looked at that text in Exodus, and we noticed how that God says, listen, if I wanted to, I could destroy you, but I won't. Because, and as it says there, for this very purpose I have raised you. And in that context of Exodus, God's not just saying that with respect to Pharaoh, but to all the Egyptians, the entire Egyptian nation. I've risen you up. I've allowed you to have this position so that I may show my power in you. So on the one hand, it's interesting how Paul uses this in verse 18. On the one hand, there is mercy in that I have every right to destroy you, to wipe you off the face of the earth, but I'm not going to because I want to show my power. Okay, so there's mercy, but at the same time, there at the end of verse 18, and on whom he wills, he hardens. That is to say that he fully allowed Pharaoh to have his heart hardened. God knew it was going to happen. And from that perspective, there's both mercy and the hardening of will on Pharaoh's part that caused ultimately the bringing about of showing God's power. And we talked before about God didn't make Pharaoh do this, but God allowed all the things that took place to take place that presented the situation as it was, where Pharaoh's mind was already hardened to begin with. He considered himself a god, as the Egyptians, they worshipped their pharaohs as if they were gods on earth, and in some cases kind of pre-gods, but as soon as they died, they became gods. And so as a result, the mind of those who were leaders of Egypt were hardened already, especially in regard to the Hebrews. So then he says in verse 19, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? So all of this, again, all the way through verse 18, this is not speaking about saved or unsaved. This is speaking to the Jewish identity of we are special because. Paul says, no, you're not. God can choose whomever he wants to show mercy or not. He can choose whomever he wants to bring about his will or not. And that has nothing to do with your decision to accept Jesus or not. So when he comes to verse 19, the Jews might say, and when he says you, this is specifically written to the saints in Rome. So again, this speaks to the Jewish mindset. It's not the Jews at large or the Jewish Christians. It's the mindset that these Jewish Christians still had that all of Israel shares. So when he says in verse 19, you will say to me then, how does he still find fault? Or why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? Well, we're seeking to do what God wants us to do. And obviously, if God's plan is such that he's arranged it this way, then we're prevented from serving God. That's the excuse. That's the argument. Why does he still find fault? God's chosen his people. God's chosen his lineage. All of this is done according to his will. Why does he still find fault? I mean, who has resisted his will from the perspective that we're seeking to obey him? Verse 20, and this is all, what it boils down to is the position that they're in, therefore dictates how they act. But God's the one who allowed this position to be in the beginning. For instance, to put it in context, The Jews are such because God made them so. The Gentiles are such because God made them so. And so their argument is, since this is the case, and we have this natural predilection to think of ourselves in this way, why is God finding fault with us? He's the one that arranged it. He's the one that caused it. Verse 20, but indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the potter have power over the clay, from the same lump to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? This is not speaking to whether or not the Jews choose to be saved. That's not what Paul's describing. What he's describing here, especially when he gets to verse 20 and 21, when he describes, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Which is to say, what Paul interprets from this hypothetical question, so what Paul's posing, he kind of rephrases that question that is hypothetically asked in verse 19 to, God, this is your fault. You made me, in our day and age, you made me having more homosexual tendencies. Or you made me in such a way to have sexual addiction. Or you made me to grow up in a household that led me against what you want me to do. Why is it my fault then if I sin? Why is it my fault if you find issue? And so when Paul says this, he's using this in the context of the Jews to say, well, you made me a Jew, God. You established everything as such. And so because we have this mindset, why is it our fault? Remember, Paul's in a context of speaking against the mindset that the Jews have. So Paul's kind of beating them to the punch of making the argument, but God made us this way. So why is it our fault that we think this way? Verse 21, does not the potter have power over the clay from the same lump to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? Which is to say, doesn't God have the power and the right, for that matter, to utilize those who are such, who make the choices that they make, to bring about His will in such a way that is favorable for those who are His people? When he says there in verse 21, who are you to question that? Well, God caused me to be this way. That's not really accurate. You're a Jew, yes. But were there Jews who accepted Christ and Him crucified on the day of Pentecost? Did God prevent them from doing that? No. Was God actively preventing Pharaoh from allowing his people to go? No. The situation was that Pharaoh, because of his situation, which yes, God allowed to take place, Pharaoh made the decision to harden his heart. That had nothing to do with God enforcing it. Pharaoh chose it. The same is true with the Jews. Just because you may be born into a situation that is disadvantageous, that is a disadvantage to you, does not mean you can blame God because you're not a faithful Christian. Everybody faces obstacles based on either the life they were born into, things, whether it's how I was raised or things I'm exposed to in my life or situations that arise outside of anybody's control that affect me. But I still make the choice whether or not to serve God. I make the choice whether or not to have the right attitude. I thought I saw a hand, Doug.
Opened her heart.
Right.
It just, God made him make a decision to say yes or no.
Right.
He does do that. He does make us make decisions.
Based on the circumstances that we face. Yep.
And it's our free will to decide yes or no. And that's how I got past that.
Right.
Forcing them to act. No, he didn't force them.
Right.
He just put them in a situation where they need to say yes or no.
Right.
That doesn't mean he didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
He knew what Pharaoh was going to do.
Right.
He knew what Libya was going to do, but he still gave them the choice.
Right. And the situation here that applies to the Jews is that, yes, God arranged it where they were born as Jews into a family of being Jews. And they were born into this society that as a whole, not all, but as a whole, they viewed themselves as better than everybody else. But does that mean that they were forced to think that way? We know for a fact that the early Christians in Jerusalem did not have those same attitudes all the time as what Paul is dealing with in Rome, or writing to that is being dealt with in Rome. Okay, many of the Jews were open and receptive, not just to Christ and Him crucified, but in Acts chapter 11, after Peter comes back and informs them about the Gentiles, perhaps one of the biggest stumbling blocks that the Jewish Christians would face, those saints in Jerusalem accepted Gentiles the right to become Christians without having to become Jews. This has nothing to do with the old law anymore. Has nothing to do with the identity of a Jew. Has everything to do with becoming a Christian, and that's it. And many of them accepted that. They praised God for it. Now, you think about the mindset of one who is prejudiced towards Gentiles, they would not be as receptive, but that choice is theirs to make. Just because, in fact, that it provides proof and evidence that you have some who accepted it and some who didn't want to accept it because they're dirty Gentiles and they wanted to hang on to elements of the old law. That was them choosing to do that. It wasn't because God made them do so. And so then this vessel of honor and vessel for dishonor, verse 21, specifically is speaking for those God chose to use and those God chose to not use. This is not to be equated to what Paul describes in 2 Timothy about vessels of honor and dishonor, those who are serving God faithfully, who are servants of God, versus those who are teaching falsehoods and doing that which they shouldn't be doing. Okay? In the context of what Paul is dealing with regarding vessel of honor and vessel of dishonor, it's those whom God used to bring about His will, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Moses, okay? And then those He didn't choose. Okay? That's why Paul paints it in that picture of vessel of honor are the ones that are used. They're honor, not because they're evil or that they're overly righteous compared to others. That's why Paul uses this in verse 21. Does not the potter have power over the clay from the same lump? Well, the context is God has fashioned a people. This is the main context. The Jews and the Gentiles. One was to bring about the Christ, the vessel of honor. The Gentiles were left out of that vessel of dishonor. It didn't have anything to do with them choosing to obey God or not, as many of the Jews weren't obeying God properly even under the old law. This is still specifically in the context of God bringing about His will. And that's why it's so important to consistently show that this is the train of thought for Paul. It's not until chapter 10 that he gets into the concept of salvation. Chapter 9, he approaches it, but then he starts at the beginning. He says, this is why Israel can't even begin to approach the concept of Christ and Him crucified. He goes to the mindset of the Jew. He addresses that first. So then in chapter 10, when he talks about the zealousness, or the zeal of the Jews, but here's the problem. Here's why they can't be saved. Because God prevents them from doing so? No, because they will not accept the end of the law for righteousness, which is Christ. That's why. Paul builds this case. He starts here by kind of applying everything he's dealt with in the prior 7 and 8 chapters. He kind of builds this mindset here. So, when he says, anything through verse 21 so far? Because I want to make sure we're consistently seeing the train of thought from Paul. He doesn't start talking about salvation until chapter 10. This is all about bringing the will of God about through Christ. Okay, he used the Jews, he didn't use the Gentiles. That's God's right. That doesn't mean that the Jews are automatically saved. In fact, that's the very thing Paul's speaking against here in chapter 9. or that they're special, or that they're better than the Gentiles. That's the very thing he's speaking against here. Yes, Joe?
Just to kind of add to that almost a little, a couple of examples, like Rahab in the New Testament,
Yeah.
like Judas. Those characters were used despite their bad characters, but at the same time, God didn't force that upon them. As opposed to that, the law actually taught, in the old law, don't commit fornication, don't do those kinds of sins. Jesus' teaching, is wrong to steal, don't defraud from other people. So God isn't forcing that character. Opposed to that, he's teaching what the right way to act is.
Right.
They have chosen that for themselves. So
You-
that kind of built on that just a little more.
Absolutely. A great example, and a lot of times in our children's classes, our kids, I think just because a lot of the material we use for this particular character in the Old Testament it's kind of an overview given some of the specifics of his life. But think about Samson for a minute, okay? Samson was not necessarily a good guy, okay? He was a womanizer. He married a Philistine, which wasn't supposed to be done anyway. He was involved in a lot of things that he shouldn't have done. And then even at the end of his life, he still called on God, but his purpose in doing so wasn't because, oh God, my actions have caused you shame. No, let me have vengeance for my two eyes. It was still about him. But did that not mean God couldn't use him to bring about God's will? He used Samson to bring judgment upon the Philistines and to deliver Israel, didn't he? Okay, Samson wasn't necessarily a great example of character, but yet God used him to bring about good for his people. Okay, I think that's a great example to show that this is that has nothing to do with what somebody chooses to be in terms of their service to God. It's who God's going to use to bring about his will. That does not mean, therefore, because God has used you to bring about his will, that you are therefore ingrained into salvation. Case in point, when Paul describes the teaching of the gospel, was it Philippians, I think? Philippians chapter 1. And then he describes how that there are some who teach the gospel out of selfish greed and ambition, okay? But then he says, but God be praised that the gospel's taught. Now, does that mean that those who are teaching the gospel with the wrong heart, with the wrong attitude and motivation, that they're okay? That in judgment, that they're not going to be judged for that wrong motivation, that selfishness, that greed that they had? No. But Paul looked to the end result that the gospel's being taught. Those individuals will face God in judgment for their motivation, but I can still be thankful that the gospel is being heard. Okay, God can still bring about his will even through the selfish ambitions and desires of those who think they're serving him. The Jews are a great example of this. Okay, yes, sir.
The point Paul's making here seems to be God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
God can do what he chooses, and indeed, oh man, who are you to reply against God?
Right.
If God wants to do this, and he doesn't get to what God chose to do
Right.
specifically yet, he's just making the point, God can do what God chooses to do.
Right.
And you're just the clay.
Yeah.
Don't argue against the potter.
You know what's interesting in verse 19, it's almost as if, who are you to question God if God has the right to do anything? Basically, the idea is, I'm saying God is unrighteous based on how I'm judging him. Do I have a right to judge God's actions? If God is just and every man a liar, God is true and every man a liar, if God is just and righteous, do I have any right whatsoever to question how he brought about his will? No. Do I have any right to question his commandments? No. And contrary to even some Christians I've spoken to in the past who are convinced that we need to have reasons for every commandment God gives us, and there needs to be a reason why. If God tells us to stand on our head for 10 minutes a day to be saved, does it matter why? No. What matters is that we obey. That, fortunately, for most of the commandments we have, we can observe reasons why these things are offered or told to us. But sometimes there may not be any rhyme or reason. But other than God said so. Is that enough? Yeah. It better be. Yeah, Doug?
We see this way of thinking today of, that's the way Mom and Daddy did it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the Jews were relying on. That's how Mom and Daddy, that's how the Jews did it. And we've got to be careful that those of us who have parents that were in the church, that's the way
Right.
Mom and Daddy did it.
Tradition,
And
yeah.
We've got to have our own faith, and I think that's what he's driving at right here, the individual making his own decision.
Right.
And here they were just repeating the pattern.
We're Jews.
Repeating the Jews.
Yep.
And
Yep.
we got to be careful that we don't do, our children don't have their own faith.
Right.
We don't have our own faith. And I'm guilty of that. I came because my parents came. And it took a while for me to have my own individual faith in God.
Well, in other words, God is my God, not just Mom and Dad's God.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And I see this is how it's applied to us today, this passage.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Trying to help us in our faith.
Yeah.
And we turn around and need to do that for our children, try to realize we don't go because I'm telling you to go.
Well, and
You need to go because God wants you to go, that you want to do it.
right. And another application is as well, is there any excuse, will there be any excuse in judgment for someone to say to God, God, you made me like this, therefore I couldn't obey? No. There's not going to be any excuse. Now, we can talk all day long till the cows come home. What about those, secret societies in the Middle East or in the Amazon who've, maybe never been reached by man to hear the gospel? That's going to be up to God. What I know is what God tells me, and that is every soul is to repent and understand that Christ is the Son of God, be baptized. That's what He tells me. Okay? Whether or not those tribes in the Amazon will be able to say to God in judgment, oh, but you put us out in the middle of nowhere, and so we couldn't hear the gospel. That's going to be between them and God, whether God's going to accept that, or whether they really did have an opportunity to hear the gospel. Doug?
It's just like you can't figure this out on your own.
Yeah.
We're too stupid. Our environment makes us like we are, and we can't help it.
Yeah.
That we don't have any intelligence where God has given us that.
Mm-hmm.
That we can decide
Right.
for ourselves.
Or we can let our environment and our upbringing make those decisions for us.
Right. And I think people cop out and say, I can't help it.
Yeah.
They don't want to change.
Right.
They, down deep, they like how they were
Right.
doing things, and they don't want to change.
No.
We,
Yeah.
they just don't see the consequences
Right.
of that
Yeah.
way of thinking of, God tells us what the consequences are.
And the fact that you had Jews who accepted Christ and Him crucified and those who didn't tells us that they were fully capable. The Bereans were more what minded?
No.
More noble-minded, more fair-minded than the others. They listened to Paul. They studied to make sure what Paul was saying was accurate. The other Jews could have done that too. They chose not to. Okay. Had nothing to do with God preventing them from doing so. Anything else through verse 21? All right, verse 22. What if God, wanting to show His wrath and to make His power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, that He might make known the riches of His glory on the vessels of mercy, which He had prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom He called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. When He describes the vessels of mercy, we know who are the vessels of mercy. Verse 24. Who are the vessels of mercy? To whom is He making known the riches of His glory? Those who obey. And then those around can see the riches of the glory that have been given to the vessels of mercy. Even us whom He called. And those that were called weren't called just of the Jews, but also of whom? The Gentiles. Paul can speak from experience of his own of preaching to the Gentiles. He can refer to Acts chapter 10 with Peter and Cornelius. But these are the ones to whom God has shown mercy. So let's break it down going backward then. So what if God, wanting to show wrath and make his power known, endured much suffering? Remember, he said to Pharaoh, this is the reason why I have allowed you to be in the position you are, to show my power. Endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. Who are the vessels of wrath then? The ones that didn't obey. The ones that didn't obey. Notice, so when Paul's saying, well, what if God, what's his point? Notice what his point is. What if God, skip the comma part, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? Can God do that? Can God choose to sow long suffering towards those who don't obey him? Towards those who choose to follow what they want to do? Can God do that? Can he be long suffering towards them? Sure. What if God wanted to make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy? Can he do that? Sure, he can do that, which he had prepared beforehand for glory. Again, does that mean that those who will be saved, that they were chosen beforehand? Okay, the vessels of mercy were defined, weren't they? What must I do to be a vessel of mercy? Those are the conditions set. But the vessels of mercy, they have been defined before. Even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. So as he says in Hosea, verse 25, I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God. Of whom is God speaking about in Hosea? The Gentiles. That tells us that this entire context has to do with the mindset that the Jews have regarding the Gentiles not being as good as they are, not being as worthy as they are, and yet Hosea, God spoke in Hosea. He says in Hosea. What does he say in Hosea? What's going to happen? Yeah, the Gentiles will one day be my people. Of course, that's predicated on them choosing to obey him. But when he says, I will call them my people who were not my people, that means outside of the Jews, who have always been known as his people, these who were not his people, that's the Gentiles. They were not beloved. It shall come to pass, as you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. We know from Romans chapter 8 that in order to be a son of God, what must we do? Be led by the what? Led by the Spirit. These are the sons of God. Doug?
I wonder how that was taken
I
when
know.
Hosea said.
I've always wondered, because Hosea is not the only one. There's a lot of prophecies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
But how was it taken at the time it was said,
I know.
for something that was going to happen in the future?
Yeah, I know. And even in the present time of Paul and the Jews, when these prophecies are seen, when they're read, how were they interpreted to be anything other than God talking about the Gentiles becoming part of his people? Yeah, unless they thought, well, that has to be through the Jews to become a proselyte or to become circumcised and then become a Christian. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of that they interpreted this. Oh yeah, Gentiles can be saved, but they have to be through us first. It's the only thing I can figure. James?
It's not clear to me when I read Hosea that he's even talking about the Gentiles.
Right.
He says, I'm casting off my people Israel.
Right.
They will be no people, they will not be beloved, and later I will call them beloved who were not beloved.
So they could have interpreted it as being
Yeah, the fulfillment
Right.
is to bring the Gentiles in with the remnant of the Jews, but I don't know that they understood it that way.
right. Right, yeah. Yeah, it could be. I mean, I'm sure they had, and again, Hosea is not the only place, but I'm sure they had ways in which they read those things that they just couldn't comprehend the idea of the Gentiles being a part of this.
But they had to
Yeah.
They had all of these prophecies in their head,
Yeah.
because that's how every sermon in Acts began with, was an Old Testament prophecy,
Absolutely.
or an Old Testament story that they all knew. That's where the beginning point was, they all had in common, and every sermon was, here's the progression to where we are today.
Right.
And this is the same thing. They knew this phrase.
Yeah.
They may not have understood it, but they knew this.
Right.
So maybe that was the purpose of it, that they would maybe
Make it-
finally, like I say, let a light bulb come
Yeah.
on and put two and two together.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So then he quotes Isaiah talking about Israel now. When Hosea was about the Gentiles, he says, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. Why does he quote this from Isaiah? What is being spoken here in prophecy in Isaiah that is helping Paul make his point? He quotes it for a reason. He says Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. There's a reason why Paul uses this. What is it?
It shouldn't be a surprise to see all the Jews reject it.
Okay. Notice how it says, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, millions and millions and millions of them. What does God say he's going to do? The remnant shall be saved. You know, when I think about the remnant, I think about, those in Israel who had bowed the knee to Baal, and Elijah, he thinks he's the last one. All these Jews, all the people of God are now serving Baal, but God says, I have saved for me how many? 7,000. 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Okay, there was a remnant. Well, God, speaking through Isaiah, says, listen, this is not something that wasn't the only time that's going to be the case. Okay, he speaks concerning Israel. Listen, Israel, they may have numbers as the sand of the sea, but I'm only going to save a remnant. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. What do you think is being referred to in verse 28 that Paul wants to bring up? What short work? What work is going to be finished? Yeah. Bringing in his Son, the opportunity for the Gentiles to be saved, for remission of sins. That work that is going to be accomplished was when Jesus said he hung on the cross, and as he died, what did he say? It is what? Finished. It is finished. Okay. And yeah, I believe that's exactly what Paul's using this for, to describe the remnant that recognizes that work. He will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness. What's Paul going to say in chapter 10? That Christ is the end of the law for what? Righteousness. Righteousness. And so that work that is cut short in righteousness, the Lord will make a short work upon the earth, the bringing of Christ and him crucified, that gospel being taught after that enters in the equation of both Jews and Gentiles having to be saved alike through Christ. Not dependent on one group of people, but dependent on, instead, Christ. Verse 29, and as Isaiah said before, unless the Lord of Sabaoth had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom, we would have been made like Gomorrah. What does that mean? If before Paul's establishing the quote from Isaiah about the idea that a remnant's going to be saved, those who recognize that work that's going to be accomplished, what's he saying here about the seed?
Same thing he's been saying. God could have utterly destroyed the Israelites, but he left the remnant to bring his seed promise about.
All right. The same thing he says in Malachi chapter 3. Yeah. The Lord changeth not, therefore you are not consumed, O sons of Jacob. The Lord had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. What is that speaking to? Wiped them out. Wiped them out. We would have been made like Gomorrah because of the choices Israel made over and over and over again. It's ironic that the Jews had such high esteem of themselves, and Paul's painting a picture. Maybe you shouldn't have such a high esteem of yourselves given your history. I mean, it's ironic that they keep going back to, oh, we're Abraham's son, seed, and well, Israel's been rejected time and time again, and God has spared a seed because of the promise in Abraham. God has not been unconditionally favorable towards Israel. He's punished them over and over again to help them understand what's happening. They keep rejecting Him. Verse 30. What shall we say then? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. Notice the two phrases that are in contrast to each other. You have righteousness of faith, and then you have the law of righteousness. We established back in chapter 4 and chapter 5 what Paul's talking about when he refers to the law of righteousness. That is the idea that by performing the works commanded of me, I therefore make myself righteous. Okay? Are we to follow the commandments of God? Yeah, we are. But if I have in my mind that by coming here and worshiping God, I'm doing God some service, I've earned some righteousness of my own. Look at what I've done. I've come and I've worshiped you. Look at the good I've done for you, God. That's works of law. That's seeking righteousness through those works of law. Whereas Abraham obeyed in faith. Didn't seek to establish himself as righteous, but rather he believed God, and who accounted him as righteous? Himself? God did. God did. And so, when Paul describes this, the Gentiles did not pursue righteousness, they've attained it. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 30. We'll end chapter 9. We will pick up chapter 9 in the questions, hopefully, Lord willing, next week. And I'll also go ahead and get Romans chapter 10 notes out on the table for Wednesday night. Probably I'll have them out. Thank you, everybody.